Lab, where we break down the art and science of storytelling. My name is Bennett. I am your host, and I'm a filmmaker and an author on a quest to understand how we can tell better stories so that we can do better work and make the world a better place. Each episode, I host one of the world's best storytellers to help you understand how to leverage storytelling to increase your sales, deepen your connections, and serve your audiences better. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode, and I hope that you love it. Jyoti, welcome to the Storytelling Lab.
Hey, Rain, good to be with you. I admire what you're doing here.
Oh, I admire what you do very much. But, however, I've got a little bit of bone to pick with you to start off with. When doing my research for this episode, I was trying to nail you down exactly who you were and what exactly you did. And
Pigeonhole me, right?
Yeah. No, can't do it, pal. You seem to be all over the place. So I'm going to ask you first, how do you define what you do in this storytelling space?
I get that it's a little convoluted, Rain, because I started off as a novelist. I published several books, fantasy, thrillers. And in 2015, I got started on business storytelling when I was a novelist in residence in Geneva. And I thought I was there just to do my research for another novel in the UN environment. But that's when I started listening to speeches by executives on sabbatical, and all sorts of fascinating people like generals and diplomats. And they were obviously people with brilliant expertise, great experience, but they put you to sleep when they got on stage because they would sound so like robots or like academics when they really weren't. And so I started to realize when I would have dinner or coffee with them, that's when they would tell stories and be human. And I realized that I had 10 years of experience as a writer to help people like executives or salespeople tell stories in business to change things in the real world. And I'd already given a lot of speeches earlier, so I really enjoy playing in different arenas and helping people do their work better by helping people to understand what they do.
Absolutely. And what I love so much about what I do here, at least on the show, is connecting with different people like yourself. And even though we all seem to have our unique paths to have landed us where we are, which is a similar space, the storytelling space, they're not so dissimilar. I mean, when I hear you describe your story, mine's very similar. I was a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker. And what led me to business storytelling was exactly the same thing. All of the lessons I learned the hard way through documentary filmmaking, which basically means filmmaking without a lot of money. I saw as an opportunity to help people that also didn't have a lot of resources that were having to create content for their brands. And also a parallel is, I don't think we can be pigeonholed. I mean, storytelling is a communication thing. So it makes sense that you enjoy to write fiction. It makes sense that you're able to help people with their presentations because storytelling is a human skill. It's a communication skill. But I do want to ask you this, and I understand this little dance a little bit myself. How do you navigate both worlds? Because you're still a writer, right? In terms of fiction stories, it's still a part of your heart. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely, Rain. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you navigate having this storytelling side of yourself, if you will, and this other more strategic, more action-based, business storytelling side of yourself? Is it easy? Is it hard? Do you have to switch gears, or does it kind of seamlessly flow from one to the other?
I think there's an incredible relief when you get to switch mindsets or tasks or locations. And writing fiction and nonfiction or working with people in business or academia helps me to do that. It's almost like a mini holiday when you get to switch. I call it disengage to re-engage. And often I'm working with a client, let's say a university, and suddenly I'll have an idea for a talk that I'm going to give for a corporate the following week. So I think our brains aren't divided in that way. And of course, the left brain, right brain hemisphere sort of idea isn't like we grew up thinking. Everything is really connected. And that's why I think it's all grist to our mill. Everything we do can inspire something else. And 4 years ago, when I got connected with the Global Peter Drucker Forum, I was surprised to discover that Peter Drucker, the founder of modern management or humanistic management, as opposed to so-called scientific management, which really isn't very scientific. Peter Drucker himself actually wrote, I believe it was 2 novels. So that was a great confirmation to me that this is possible.
It's such a good point that one, it inspires other stories or other angles and perspectives of stories. But it helps you. It helps you see them in a different way as well. I think that most people, I would argue, that are in this space would have that creative side of storytelling to them as well. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. In fact, it may almost require that you can at least operate in that or from that perspective. I like that you said it's not really two sides of the brain. They're or maybe it's two halves of the same coin, something like that.
Yeah,
Um,
there's this concept of talent stacking as well. So it's really helpful to be good at things that maybe aren't a usual combination. So there
mm,
are a lot of people in storytelling since you and I got started, even since you and I made the switch, in my case, 9 years ago. I remember during COVID, the books on storytelling seemed to be coming out every week.
yeah.
And I made the most of that time myself to write my own. But it really helps to have a track record like yourself and say, hey, I help businesses in their storytelling, and I come at that from the angle of a documentary filmmaker.
Yeah.
And what you, the people that you're working with, what you want to do is really provide that sort of documentary view so that people can understand what you're doing
Mhm.
and the journey that you've gone on. So it's a natural fit, and yet it's something that I don't see a lot of people doing, Rain. I think you're the first documentary filmmaker in business storytelling. And similarly, there aren't so many novelists who do what I do in business.
Yeah, I totally love that you went there, and I totally agree. And I think the people that don't get it right, I don't really like that expression, um, don't really carve out exactly their unique perspective to it. I mean, mine is kind of natural and inherent to my journey. I'm a documentary filmmaker, so I can not only but primarily view stories from that lens, and that's why I help people primarily with video storytelling. And I think it's very important that we all carve out our own unique perspective on it. If you had to define yours, if I was just meeting you, right? And I was like, okay, well, how can you help me with my brand stories? What's your take versus someone else in our space? What's your approach uniquely?
So my clients who get the most value from working with me are organizations creating a culture of storytelling.
Mm,
These days, a lot of leaders have discovered or started to hear about the power of telling stories in business, but their MBA didn't tell them how to do it. So that's something I can help them do. And I do work with individual executives and leaders and founders and so on. Uh, but what about when they're not on the stage? A lot of the time, storytelling depends on individual charismatic leaders, but you don't have a town hall all that often.
mhm.
You certainly don't meet in person that often, and people, your workforce isn't watching clips of you every day. So you really want your influence to be there when you're gone, right? When you leave the stage, do your stories live on? Have you modeled what it looks like to tell stories so that people get what you're all about?
Mhm.
I think of Sam Walton at Walmart, and his COO at the time, Sodakist, went to do what Sam loved to do, which was visit competitors all over the world. He just loved to go into supermarkets and shopping centers. So he drags along Don Sodakist, who rolls his eyes and thinks this competitor sucks, right? There's like terrible. There's boxes in the aisles. Nobody's there to greet them or help them out. Doesn't even look that orderly or clean. And they meet back at the car 10 minutes later. And Sam asks Don, so what do you think? And Don says, hey, these guys, they're not competition for us. Like, we are so much better at everything. What do you think, Sam? And of course, Sam Walton says, did you see that pantyhose rack? The quality of that stuff is amazing. Hey, we're being left behind. We need to find out how they do that, right? So he's always trying to improve. So that's something that Don was able to model. He was telling stories about how Sam Walton thought and how he taught. And that really is what helped create a culture at Walmart and make it the biggest company on earth, at least in terms of number of employees. So that's the kind of thing that I do that not many other people do. I help people scale their influence by systematizing their stories.
Well said. Speaking of our unique journeys and perspectives in this storytelling space, I also think yours might be the first time I've heard this particular path, meaning you were writing novels at a very young age. I got to go back and learn a little bit more about your childhood. I also wrote stories at a very young age. I did not, however, publish novels at that time. So tell me a little bit about that journey for you. I'm always interested in what leads people, in their head and in their heart to stories, and where that starts to happen and take shape for them in their lives. Yours clearly happened at a very young age. I want to know how. Why?
So I was born on the 22nd of the 11th. That's speaking as a European. So
Right.
November the 22nd, 1988, with a twin brother. Now, being born on 221188 with a twin brother who
Wow.
liked to read fantasy, we thought we were destined for greatness.
And you were.
And of course, we had to go to school and do what our parents and teachers said. So we didn't have a lot of ways to save the world other than in our fantasy. So that's why we loved going on imaginary adventures. We called them quests or questos. And we would draw maps and come up with characters and then act out those adventures. And because we thought we were pretty big deals, we wanted to write down those stories so that other people could benefit from these imaginary adventures as well. So that's how it all started out. From the ages of between 6 and 11, we started a dozen stories, and of course never wrote more than 4 or 5 pages, like a lot of people, until we were 11 years old, and we were tidying our room in the attic, which we shared. And I discovered a pile of papers of these character sketches and maps, and chapter 1, and sadly, very rarely, chapter 2 or chapter 3.
Right.
And so I decided, just in terms of having that ambition to finish a whole book. So I enlisted my twin brother. I was kind of like the slave driver, and pushed us to complete this draft before the age of 12, which we did. But of course, no publisher wanted that drivel.
When children have that sort of mindset, I have found that there's generally someone who, if not encourages it, at least embraces it. Who is that person or people in your lives that gave space for you all to have that creative freedom to go on these quests, as you say?
It was the whole family, really. I'm very grateful for them. So
Yeah.
my father is a university professor of English originally, but ended up working at a Swiss bank. So again, you have these two very different worlds
Mm.
that he was able to bring together in his way. He was also a poet. And so my elder brother and sister actually published a poem each, I think, when they were quite young in the early teens. And that really was a mind shift for me, because I realized that the books we're reading were written by people who are still alive. It's sort of like when you're listening to Mozart, you think, okay, yeah, sure, he's dead, right? And you don't really realize, at least I didn't, because I grew up in a household where we always listened to classical music. I assumed people didn't write music anymore, right?
Yeah.
So the penny dropped when I realized, hey, if my brother could do it, if my sister can, maybe I can.
Yeah.
And our mum drew maps with us. So she helped us blow up the Lord of the Rings map to, I don't know, A2 or something. And we had that hanging on the wall for many years. And both parents would read us goodnight stories. So it was really a group effort, I would say.
I love that so much. And yeah, absolutely. I had a similar experience where I loved movies very much as a child. And it took a long time to obviously realize that people made those movies, right? I loved E.T., for example, when I was very young, and it took a long time to understand that there was a Steven Spielberg somewhere behind that that is like directing everybody. And once you realize that, you're like, oh, yeah, it can be done, perhaps one day by me.
Did you get
Um,
into story structure as well as a documentary filmmaker?
so I was always big into movies. My family and my mother specifically helped generate that love. Um, wasn't later until I started doing documentaries like nonfiction work, but I used to write more like horror film or stories when I was a kid. They were always about some monster that some mad scientist, created in a lab. Again, I loved, movies like E.T. And I was always watching movies that I was way too young to watch. Now I get to do the same thing with my kids. But yeah, I went on a similar journey where I realized that there was someone making those things. So I didn't think I understood it was story structure, but I was immersed into the scenes and the romantic idea of these stories. So because of that, consequently, my whole life I've kind of viewed in as a movie scene, right? There was an old show on HBO when I was a kid called Dream On, and I always related it to that because the kid watched TV his whole life, and as he's an adult, maybe having a fight with his girlfriend, it always would cut to this old black and white show of a boyfriend and girlfriend fighting that he was remembering from childhood. So he's spent his whole life kind of in daydreams of these old TV show scenes. That's what I felt like my life was like. What era was this that you were growing up in? I don't necessarily need to ask your direct age, but was this 80s, 90s?
Yeah, so I was born 88, so this was in the
Okay.
90s.
Okay, so I'm a little bit older than you, but not too much. What were some of the stories at that time that inspired this? Because were more of a fantasy or sci-fi writer when you were younger.
Yeah, definitely more fantasy.
Hmm.
We had read Narnia,
Yes.
Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, George MacDonald, Stephen Lawhead. So a lot of mythic
Yeah.
history, you could say, or high fantasy. And then, of course, when Harry Potter came along, we were always at the same age as he was.
Oh,
So
that's
we
awesome.
had a lot of identification in that way.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
Star Wars,
Oh,
wow, yeah, we watched those movies 20, 30 times. We knew the whole script off by heart.
absolutely. Classic story structure too, as it were. Um,
Exactly. I
when,
think George Lucas was the first person to use the hero's journey
yeah,
in Hollywood using Joseph
mm,
Campbell's research.
yeah,
And since then, of course, everyone has tried to emulate that.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think we have been seeing some highly formulaic sort of movies. And sometimes it's okay because story structure is really like the shape, and it's up to you what you put in it. It could have a very different flavor from something that has the exact same shape.
absolutely.
Yet I think we have gone overboard
Hmm.
to the point where, yeah, maybe AI can write scripts and make movies, right? Because what we're doing is so formulaic.
That's a good point. How do you use something like the hero's journey or any story structure to help guide your business stories? And does it make things unnecessarily complicated? And, I'll let you, it seems like you already know where I'm going with that or where you might want to go.
Sure. So story structure is a guide, and ideally, it's there while we're working on our story at a certain point in it. So probably not at the very start, unless we use it to brainstorm. And then perhaps at the end. So I always advise my clients or students to have two different hats. One is the creator hat and one is the editor hat. Don't mix them up. I remember being stuck halfway writing through a book because I'm a perfectionist. So I saw all these things I needed to edit. And that was one of my main lessons in the last, 20 years now of being a full-time writer and storyteller is finish the draft
Yeah,
or finish the story and don't become critical. Just start telling it. And then you can use that sort of a structure to evaluate. So the hero's journey, and I think you were hinting at this as well, can be much too complex for a manager or a CEO or a salesperson because you don't have 45 minutes or 2 hours. It's not a Hollywood
right.
blockbuster. You have 2 minutes maybe. So we can learn the principles. We can apply them. Things like crossing the threshold, the familiar world, the unfamiliar world
Yeah.
that the heroes go into in a story. We have to be aware that when we're talking to people, our world is not their world, right? We suffer from the curse of knowledge, also
Mm.
known as the curse of expertise, which is that people who tend to be very knowledgeable or experienced at something tend to speak a different language and think several steps ahead of people who haven't had that experience. So I myself use a distilled version of the hero's journey. It's the Domino Framework, because you want, let's put it this way, start with the obstacle, right? A lot of the time when we have a message, even whether that's web copy or other marketing material or in a talk, we don't know where to start. We don't know what to include and what to leave out. And I find the domino structure very useful for that. And that's why I call it domino, because as soon as you've got the first stone, then the others fall into place. So that's the desire, obstacle, mentor, inspiration, navigation, and outcome.
I didn't realize it was an acronym. What I love about that is it's also a metaphor, where I thought you were going with this, and it still works. Is one thing that I struggle with in watching people tell stories or teach stories is the misunderstanding of sequencing, right? Of, we might just make a scene or a sentence that's irrelevant. It's a tangent. And so I try to help people understand that, like, one thing, it's a cause and effect. One thing happens because of the other. And I use the metaphor, like a trail of breadcrumbs, right? It leads us along the line. Now you can mix and match that sequence later for creative purposes, like a Quentin Tarantino or something like that. But the actual linear narrative is that piece. So when you were saying domino, I was thinking that, like, yeah, this one falls, and then that one falls, and then the next one, and then the next one. Instead of just a bunch of, if they're not in a line, right? No matter if it's a curved line or whatever, if they're not in a sequence, it doesn't work. You couldn't put dominoes randomly and it have that effect.
Yeah.
So even though that's not what you were necessarily describing, that's the image that popped into my mind, and I kind of love it because it still works.
Oh, I like the way you unpack that, Rain, and I can't agree more when it comes to the sequencing. This really seems to be the key understanding for people. When they understand it's not about information, it's about experience, telling a story. And it took me several years of running workshops before I understood how I could explain this to people. So I say, what's the difference between information and an experience? Well, one is abstract and one is concrete and so on. But I would tell a story about a time when I was a teenager and I wanted to impress my peers, and we were playing this icebreaker, which involved 100 balloons floating around a room, and we were two teams, and each team had to get the balloons onto the other side of the playing field, which was a cellar. And so I tell this story, and I build up to this moment when everyone and I think that I'm going to score the last point, the final, perhaps victory point for my team. And so I jump up feeling great about myself, and I'm really glad that everyone's watching me. And I smash that light. I think it's a balloon, right? I think it's a balloon that got caught up there in the ceiling because I'm not wearing my spectacles. You see, so already now trying to summarize that story, Rain, I'm messing up the sequencing because I mentioned that I have spectacles and I'm short-sighted after the fact, right? Because I was trying to make that story shorter because, I spend maybe 3 or 4 minutes telling that story in detail. And then I ask someone, okay, could you please summarize that story? And they'll say, yeah, you smashed a light because you're short-sighted and you thought it was a balloon. So again, the sequencing changes the order of events. And I say, why isn't anyone laughing, right? It's the same content, it's the same information, but you didn't give it to us as an experience.
That's so good. I love that. When you were coming up, and you and your brother, what's your brother's name, if you don't mind me asking?
Suresh.
So you all were writing these stories. Who became some of your mentors in the process?
We were very fortunate to have, like I mentioned, quite a literary father and mother, and
Yes.
they both did read our works. We discussed the story with each other, my twin brother and myself, which is the advantage of being twins. And we discussed it with our parents and with our siblings and anyone who would listen, basically. But later on, when we really were pretty serious about this, we sent it to publishers at the age of 11, got our first, we didn't even get a rejection. We never heard back. When we were 12, we tried again. We sent it to 5 publishers this time, and we heard back from all 5, which was amazing until we opened those envelopes and got 5 rejections. So the publishers themselves started serving as, you could say, sort of mentors or sounding boards, because whereas the second version was just declined, and I think probably the third and fourth as well, at some point, publishers started to give us feedback. They would say, hey, it's great that you're writing and you're young, pat on the head.
Yeah.
But you need to work on your dialogue, or your characters are cardboard. We don't believe they're real people. So that was feedback that we could work with. We also happened to be in touch with Richard Adams, who wrote Watership Down, the bunnies, and Shardik, and many other books. And so Richard very kindly ended up writing our very first endorsement for our first book, Conspiracy of Calaspia. And we had other mentors along the way, people who had written books, sometimes nonfiction. My father is more of a academic, poetry, yes, but not so much fiction writing himself. So you also had to beware of the kind of pointers you got, because sometimes it would get quite academic feedback, right, or very poetic in his case. So you really learn as you're going along who can you learn what from. And it's good for the character, because you're getting this rejection all the time, and if you're lucky, you're also getting some comfort.
I think that's a great inadvertent point about qualifying your feedback, or at least understanding who it's coming from and what their unique perspectives or biases are. I think it's very easy for us, especially if we're switching back to business storytelling now, to be like, to just hear advice and be like, oh, that's what I got to do. For example, use the hero's journey, right? Which you see a lot. And it's like, yeah, if I'm a not a professional storyteller, but I have a business or brand that I want to tell stories for, I don't need the 17-step hero's journey. It's way too convoluted. I don't even need the abridged 12-step version.
It's Domino, it's 8 steps.
Exactly. But that's such a good point. It's like we're all going to bring our different perspectives and our different biases to it. But I don't think enough of us on the receiving end of information go through that filter of understanding, well, yeah, he's a poet, so he's going to look at it that way. Or if we hear storytelling advice out there on LinkedIn or wherever, does that align with my goals, my company size, my mission and direction, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, there's a million different filters. The point is to have a filter and understand what gets you closer to telling the stories in the way you should be telling them versus someone else. Does that make sense? I'm kind of putting that together as I go.
That's exactly it. I talk about story types, which means that each story that you collect intentionally in your story bank or curated collection has a business objective. And if you think about them in that way, then that helps change the mindset from I'm in marketing or branding or Hollywood, because actually more people that I work with are scientists and engineers and executives, and they don't have to become someone else. And they need a different kind of feedback than maybe some of our peers who are filmmakers or novelists might give them, because we understand that there are different sizes of story as well as different types of story. So I help people, basically I give them permission to tell simple stories that wouldn't impress anyone as a story, but that's exactly the point. A story is simple and it's subtle, which is why we can use them in business meetings and presentations, and no one bats an eyelid and thinks, how is that a story? People don't evaluate stories, they experience them. So we want feedback at a certain stage, but we also don't want to draw attention to the fact that we're telling stories in business, because we don't want people to evaluate them. We just want them to receive the message and think, wow, that Rain is a great communicator. Never really understanding that is because Rain is telling stories. So one of my clients, a very senior banker in Switzerland, lots of banks here, he was had a boss who was head of wealth management for the entire bank. And he came back from a sabbatical, and my client thought to himself, I don't know what's changed, but this guy is such a good communicator all of a sudden. And it took him a long time, in fact, until he started working with me, to realize after the fact, oh yeah, that's the moment when his boss started telling stories.
I love that. You grew up in India, is that right?
My father is Indian and grew up there. I was born in the UK and have visited India many times, but never lived there for more than 3 months at a time. We moved to Switzerland when my twin and I were 7 years old, and
Okay.
we've stayed pretty much.
Got you. That's where I was going with that. I was wondering when the change to Switzerland happened. Where in the UK?
In Surrey, which is
Yeah.
about an hour west of London.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So I know that you've co-authored. We talked about this briefly before we started with another North Carolinian like myself, Davis Bunn, I believe.
Davis, yeah, and he has
Da-
a pen name, Thomas Locke. We've
okay,
collaborated on 2 books where he's used his pseudonym, Thomas Locke.
okay. And then have you collaborated more than those 2 times?
We've actually recently completed a 3rd thriller, which is to do with the financial system and
Oh,
AI and trades and that sort of a thing. And we just signed our book deal. So we are very excited to be publishing with Bloodhound Books, based out of the UK, but it's a global English
nice.
deal. And that'll be published, I believe, next July.
Awesome. Great news. Love to hear that. I hope I get my signed copy, pal.
Thanks. Yeah.
But I was interested in that because, and I think you actually call attention to this on your website, but seems to be a significant age gap between the two of you. I'm really curious how that partnership was created.
So Davis and I met in 2012, I think it was, at Oxford,
Okay.
where Davis happens to be a writer in residence.
Hmm.
And there's something called the C.S. Lewis Summer Institute,
Okay.
which is half in Oxford, half in Cambridge. And a lady called Joy Jordan Lake, who's also a fantastic novelist. She writes historical fiction. In fact, I visited her and her family a few weeks ago in Nashville, Tennessee. And so I was in Joy's writing class. I was 18, I think 19 at the time, had recently published our first book. So I was loving being a real author and learning from all these other authors like Joy. And then this gentleman, Davis, walks in, and he wasn't really a part of the conference, but because he's the writer in residence of Oxford, he wanted to visit our class. We stayed in touch. We swapped books. I loved his work. And we would email each other maybe once a year. We would have the occasional phone call. And then about 5 years ago, we decided that, Davis shared an idea. I started building on it. And the partnership just developed from there. And that's really the way that we think of our partnership. We're building a bonfire between us, and we are both adding logs to that fire. That's really the way that it feels like when we collaborate.
I like that. One of my favorite parts about growing up, growing older, growing wiser, is we're able to cultivate friendships that are outside of our generation. No shade to Davis, by the way. But I have a startup that I'm co-founding now, and a friend of mine who's decades older than I am, and that's not one unique case. I have a lot of friends that are older. I think that's a really cool part about growing up is you aren't limited to when you're 14. Being a good friend with a 34-year-old is weird. At best. But yeah, when you're 40, a 60, 65-year-old, you can be very close with. I wonder, how has that impacted or influenced your approach to storytelling? Does it even factor in at all that you're, coming from, different generations or perspectives?
It's so enriching, Rain. And the interesting thing about Davis, well, many interesting things, if you look at his record, he's published, I don't know, 60, 70 books.
Wow.
He's in his 70s now, so twice my age, but very humble about, not I know how this thing works, but we get to talk very much at eye level with each other. Now, Davis has sold 8 million books and published so many, and he's kind of like a machine in that he writes
Clearly.
4 books every year, plus often one screenplay, plus whatever else that he does. Earlier, it was teaching at Oxford. So I have huge admiration for Davis. And when we started to work together, I sort of assumed that I knew what his process would be like, because how else can you write 4 books a year plus everything else? I assumed that Davis Bunn had a very cookie cutter approach, and he had his, 3-act structure, 52 scenes. This is what happens at 12.5% the way through the
Right.
story. Very much the screenwriting approach, which has become more of a science than an art sometimes if you listen to some of the teachers. And I really appreciate those turning points and, the hook and the whole theory. But Davis Bunn does not operate that way. He's very much seat of the pants writing. He sketches 4 or 5 scenes ahead. So I was able and still am able to learn a lot about Davis's approach. Even though mine is different, I do like to begin with the end in mind and work my way backwards. I'm more like an engineer that way, which again is why I think we can complement each other, right? It's not just the age difference, it's the way we approach our craft as well.
Speaking of the cookie cutter-ness of screenplays and business stories as well, it seems these days, I'm reminded earlier when we were talking about that structure, you said something that reminded me of what a screenwriter guest on the show, his name is Paul Gio, said. And it was about structure. And you had said something about, I'll paraphrase, but basically writing from the heart. And we were talking about writing and editing, or creating and editing.
The two hats.
Yeah, exactly. And he said it in different words, but he was like, structure is something that happens later. He was like, you write what's here and get it out. Like you said, getting that first draft out, and then you go back and you can structure or restructure it. But I find that too many people use the cookie cutter method, and they look at the structure, whether it's the hero's journey or what else, and they just try to fill it in like Mad Libs, right? Like fill in the blank to build their story that way. But the people that I talk to that do this professionally, almost 100% of the time say like that, you don't start that way. That's something that's the editing process. Then you come back and you make it like, okay, how can I make this better? Ooh, what if I move scene 5 at the very beginning or something like that?
Yeah, the experimentation is the fun and sometimes the aggravating bit, precisely because it isn't cookie cutter. I have this experience almost every time I prepare a major speech or write another book. I believe now I know how it works, right? I've done this many times before, but no, each time the process plays a trick on me, and I find myself needing to compulsively switch something around and see how that feels. It's sort of like the muscle memory of a golf player. They don't think about how they're standing and holding the rack and all that and what their foot is doing when they hit the ball, right? No, they did that maybe to start with, but they certainly don't do it anymore. So how can we, as people who have that sort of intuition now, having read hundreds of books or watched movies and helped dozens or hundreds of other organizations or executives tell their stories, how can we help people speak or write from the heart? So I think to your point about not starting with the theory, with the structure, where I start with my clients is typically I look at the substance, right? What do we have to work with? Forget the theory, forget even the goals where we're going, right? Let's just talk about what there is. Who are you? What is the purpose of your organization? These very basic and yet deep questions. And that's often when the stories emerge, when they're not thinking about storytelling, right, and the structure and so on, or the marketing and the outcome and the numbers. And that's the beauty of story, because it really is something that combines the personal and the professional, right, the intellect and the imagination. And that's why we can't take that overly cerebral approach to it. So I start with the substance, and then we look at the structure that will fit that substance based on your desired outcome. And it's not always the Domino Framework or the hero's journey. It might be one of half a dozen other structures, or none. We might just wing it and see what emerges, because like I said, the muscle memory, we recognize excellence. And that's also why, at least at this stage, artificial intelligence really isn't a threat to someone like us, because you need to have, you need to be able to recognize quality. And a lot of people obviously don't recognize quality if they're not immersed in that subject matter as we are. There's an interesting study that Adam Grant cites in his book Originals about how to be creative. And this is something that our viewers could even practice, because it doesn't necessarily take working with Rain or Jyoti to have a story coach, because we do all listen to stories. And yet, obviously I'm differentiating between the professional storyteller and so on. But the great thing, you can go to someone who really has never watched a movie in their lives, or is not interested in story whatsoever. Maybe your manager, or the board, or whoever. And then you can do, this is what Adam Grant discovered and suggests. You just get them to spend a few minutes on the same task to get their own creative juices flowing. And then their feedback becomes so much more useful, because now they can actually recognize quality.
Absolutely. You mentioned AI, and I wanted to go here anyway, so I think this is a perfect time. I know that you recently spoke at an event about AI, or a narrative in AI. Is that correct?
Yeah, just a few days ago, the
Oh, really?
ETH, which is Einstein's university, put on the AI plus X Summit, which is Switzerland's largest AI event. And I got to speak on new narratives for our future with AI.
So I don't necessarily need you to give that speech right now. Let's have another 60 minutes of the conversation. But I do want to address the role AI plays in storytelling, or perhaps the role storytelling will play in the age of artificial intelligence. Is there a reason to be concerned? Is it just a tool that we can leverage? How do these worlds of creative, heart-driven stories from human stories, how does that merge and intersect with the technological coming of artificial intelligence?
One thing I believe artificial intelligence is already forcing us to do is to emphasize the importance of the in-person and the personal, because you can ask AI to come up with a story, but you can't ask AI to invent your past, or how you feel or think.
Right.
And going forward, in an age where people will be able to fake anything from behind a keyboard and show you something on a monitor, the importance will rise of trust, the need for trust, and people's in-person ability to communicate well, to earn people's trust, will, I believe, skyrocket, because a lot of people will rely on the crutch of generative AI. And so it is a big question how schools will respond, universities, many questions. And that's one reason I'm so excited to be a part of the cutting edge, working with various organizations who are implementing AI. It requires storytelling to scale or implement any technology. I'm working with other great groups who have incredible technology that can save millions of hours of work in the Fortune 500 company. And yet even they're finding it difficult to scale, because there's the operational side, and then there's the executive buy-in, and that's one bridge that needs to be crossed. So I see myself as a corporate translator, or I help other people to translate, cross-functional teams, disciplines, etc. Now, I think AI can help us to an extent, and it's of course always getting better. So it is a mixed bag of a response. You can't say is it negative, is it positive, right? It is what it is.
Yeah.
And it is ultimately a tool, and I encourage everyone to get to use it, to get to understand it, because I am also concerned medium and long term, not necessarily in the technology itself. Though as a creator, of course, there are questions around copyright and IP and so on.
Sure.
My greater concern is that people will use AI as an excuse, because of fear mongering, to implement centralization and control and things like that. And even though the technology never becomes that threat of super intelligence, Terminator or Matrix sort of scenario, people could use the narrative that might be the case, to change policy and that sort of a thing, because that way it would become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Are you still working with this VR brand gamification company?
Yes, Ormivy, exactly.
Almavi?
Yeah. So
Talk to me about that.
so Raphael Zaxa is the founder, brilliant guy. He had an ad agency, which he basically gave away to his employees and spun out this one technology of the virtual reality. And so he created something he calls the real world metaverse. Because, when Mark Zuckerberg presented his whole meta,
Mhm.
with the rebrand, and he was floating around with these aliens and robots and stuff, to a lot of people, that was a little too out there for everyday business. And so what we've been doing is working at a very sensible Swiss level of helping organizations to basically virtualize their campuses, their premises, and then we can create virtual tours. You don't have to fly thousands of people to the headquarters in Switzerland or wherever your HQ might be. You can have personalized, individualized routes and even gamification. So a few of the experiences that I helped create have been virtual escape rooms and things like that, where we've helped a pharmaceutical company to explain how they develop products and things like that. So very complex scientific sort of material at times in a very easy to access experience.
Do you remember when you kind of had the light bulb go off that pushed you to lean more heavily into business storytelling? You've been a fictional author, and you alluded to this earlier, but do you remember when you had that pivot, that mental shift to see that as an opportunity as well?
So the first experience was in 2015 at the GCSP, this United Nations organization.
Mhm.
But my next light bulb moment, to be honest, in terms of my business, came when I was trying to get a job. This was a few years later, so maybe 2017. And I wanted to get married and wanted some security. I'd been a starving artist for long enough. So I applied for a job, an entry-level job at an insurance company. And they were looking for someone who'd studied psychology or even history. It was quite broad, the things that they were looking for. It could have been one of multiple things. So I thought to myself, given my experience, I've given by now hundreds of talks in different countries. I've written a couple of books, etc. Sure, I dropped out of school at the age of 15, so I don't have a university degree, but probably this is good enough. I've taught at a university by now, at least as a guest lecturer, right? So in 2017, I applied, and I didn't get even a foot in the door because I didn't tick those boxes. And the funny thing is, a few months later, this same insurance company approached me to train their middle managers. And so I thought to myself, you could have saved a lot of money if you had employed me full time
Right.
as an entry level worker. So that was one of the early experiences that taught me that if you position yourself correctly, you can provide the value that you have to give where it'll be appreciated and compensated. And that isn't always necessarily the expected route.
That's a good point. And it's inspiring too. And I love that you're still able to pursue your creative stories as well as helping out all these companies and creating a career out of it too. That's very inspiring for someone like me who also juggles both of those worlds. Now, even though you did drop out of school, and maybe you weren't traditionally educated, it's very clear that you're an educated person and that you're very smart. You wouldn't be a part of all these fellowships and all of these, jobs and gigs that you've had if you weren't. Do you think one has to be smart in order to be an effective storyteller?
Not at all. There was some study. I really wasn't prepared for this one, so I can't cite it. But actually, you find that people who tend to have a lower official educational background or come from maybe more difficult homes actually tend to be better storytellers. There's also this concept of if you're in a more intellectual sort of circle, people talk about ideas, and if maybe you are from a more working class background, you tend to talk about people. And talking about people is really where the stories are, not so much at that abstract elite intellectual level. Of course, the fun happens when you can bring the two together, when you can use analogous thinking and things like that. So I don't think there's an answer to your question like it's always this way. But I do find that working with incredibly smart people at times, people with multiple doctorates and who've built incredible companies and so on, they do tend to be smart in a particular way, which doesn't always help them be great storytellers, because they might not be so in tune in terms of what maybe other people tend to like, right? So it's difficult for that empathy bridge, as I call it. But there are very simple ways of helping people like that to learn to tell those stories that could help other people to understand that they are indeed a human being and highly relatable, such as what I call the bridge story, which is simply emphasizing something that you have in common, or why you appreciate something about the type of audience that you're addressing.
Absolutely. I think you answered perfectly, because we are still swimming around this same theme of like, it's never just one way. And it's usually a marriage of the intellectual and the emotional. So yeah, I think that was beautifully
And there's
handled.
not one kind of intelligence. So
Correct.
we need to
100%.
work with our strengths and compensate for our weaknesses.
Absolutely, my friend. Before we go, I want to ask one final question. There was a quote that I read, maybe on one of your websites, I believe, that I just wanted to ask you about, and see if you wouldn't mind expanding on. And I'm paraphrasing, but it's something along the lines of: storytelling is the ability to convey your own inner world and thoughts as clearly as possible. And through story, you understand yourself better and the world. Are you familiar with the quote that I'm referencing?
Did I say that?
It was on one of your sites, and so I don't know if it was the one where you and maybe Davis's books were together or something like that. So it may not be a direct quote from you. Um,
It definitely resonates, Rain. I find this all the time. I think I know what to say, and then I sit down and try to write it
mm,
or speak it out loud, and I really don't. So, first of all, storytelling, communication is a tool to bring clarity to ourselves. This is especially important when it comes to things like a company's strategy, right? Why are we taking this particular direction? Well, it's based on some numbers or something. But that's really not where strategies come from, because that's backward looking, right? We need to think forward, and we have to connect many different dots. And so it really does take that reflection and writing, or even going for a walk and thinking about that story or telling it to someone. These are steps towards clarity for ourselves, and then being able to relate that in a way that it will be understandable to other people. And hopefully they'll like what we're saying, they'll agree with it. And finally, they're much more likely to be able to act, because we've made it actionable. Stories are actionable. And at the end of the day, it's not about what we know, it's about what we do. And maybe even coming back to artificial intelligence, I believe that it's a knowledge revolution on par with the printing press or the internet, and maybe even bigger. But the next revolution in information won't be about knowledge, it will be about implementation, because we all know so much more than we're able to put into practice. We all have a higher story that we aspire to, and we can hold each other accountable, but we can also work with the tools at our disposal, such as artificial intelligence, to talk out what we really want to be doing as organizations, as individuals.
Jyoti, I think that's a perfect place for us to end today. And like much of our conversation, no matter how poor the pitch I tossed up was, you smacked it out of the park.
You've done a great job, Rain. Articulated some of my thinking very nicely. This was a joy. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
I appreciate it, my friend. I will see you out there in the story world.